3. The Executive Branch. Chapter 8. The Presidency. Our chapter objectives describe the requirements for the office of President and the role of Vice President, discuss the historical foundations of the Electoral College and its advantages and disadvantages, evaluate how politics influences cabinet appointments and relationships, and describe the components of the executive office of the President. Section 1. President and Vice President. The duties of the President. Presidents have enormous power and responsibility in government. Presidents make sure that the national laws are fully executed. So they serve as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, appoint top officials, federal judges, and ambassadors, and meet with the heads of foreign governments. The President's term and salary. The 22nd Amendment limited presidents to 2 terms and a maximum of 10 years. Congress determines the President's salary, $400,000 beginning in 2001. And in addition, many benefits are provided for presidents while in office and in retirement. Presidential qualifications. The constitutional requirements. A candidate must be a natural-born citizen, at least 35 years old, and a resident of the United States for 14 years. Experience in government is an unwritten but important qualification. Candidates for office must have access to sources for raising large amounts of money in the presidential election campaign. Successful presidential candidates usually hold moderate political beliefs. Most presidents have shared similar backgrounds, ethnic, economic, racial, and gender. Being president underscores personal strengths and weaknesses. Presidential succession. The 25th Amendment established the order of succession to the presidency, which is Vice President, first in the line of succession, then Speaker of the House, President pro tem of the Senate, the Secretary of State, and then other cabinet members, and spelled out what happens when the vice presidency is vacant. The 25th Amendment also set forth rules to be followed if a president becomes disabled. The Vice President's role. The Vice President's work depends on what jobs, if any, the President assigns. Although presidents before Eisenhower generally ignored their Vice Presidents, presidents since have tried to give their Vice Presidents more responsibility. The National Governors Association helps the state's governors solve common problems. By joining together, they become active in national policy making. The states are obligated to conduct and pay for all elections of federal officials and to consider the ratification of constitutional amendments under the Constitution. The courts as umpire. The Supreme Court and the federal courts settle disputes between the states and the national government. The Supreme Court has supported the supremacy of the national government. Section 2. Electing the President. The original system. The President and the Vice President are elected by electoral votes in the Electoral College rather than by popular vote. Originally, the candidate with the most electoral votes would become President, and the candidate who received the second highest number of electoral votes would become Vice President. In the election of 1800, it produced a tie which was eventually settled by the House of Representatives. Specifically in this case, what the situation was is that the Constitution had not taken into account political parties. They had made no plan, really, for having political parties. And so the Democratic Republicans, of which Thomas Jefferson was the party leader, ran Thomas Jefferson in that election, and he selected Aaron Burr as his running mate. And what ended up transpiring is that every elector that cast a vote for Jefferson cast a second vote for Aaron Burr. Now, with the idea of avoiding ties, they gave all of the electors 2 electoral votes. thinking that that would prevent there from being a problem. But being that every single elector that voted for Jefferson also cast a vote for Burr, they ended up tied in the Electoral College. When there's a tie in the Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives, and they will vote to settle it. Unfortunately, many of the opposing parties' members in Congress, particularly we're talking the Federalist Party in this election of 1800, many of them preferred Burr to Jefferson, and ultimately what happened is they ended up voting, I think it was like 36 times in the House before finally Jefferson won by a single vote. So since then, they have changed this with the 12th Amendment, which was added in 1804, and this required separate ballots for president and vice president. So the electors still get 2 votes, but they get one for president, one for vice president now. So the modern system. Under the modern Electoral College, all states, except for Maine and Nebraska, use a winner-take-all system, which means the candidate who has the most popular votes in a state takes all of the state's electoral votes. Now, of course, that doesn't always hold true, because the Electoral College is always held at a later date, and you could always have a disloyal elector, although that rarely happens. Presidential elections take place every 4 years on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And that might sound a little confusing, but literally what it means is that if the first falls on a Tuesday, it will not be that Tuesday, it would be the second Tuesday. So in other words, it's going to be between the 2nd of November and the 8th. So it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday, or the day after the first Monday in November would be Election Day. The Electoral College vote is cast in December. Electoral College issues. Some critics say that the winner-take-all system is unfair. For example, if you look at the state of California, we have 55 electoral votes presently. Well, that by far is the largest number of electoral votes. However, a candidate that wins the state, even by a narrow margin, takes all 55 electoral votes. And it doesn't really tell you how close the vote was within the state. It is possible for a third-party candidate to take enough electoral votes to prevent any candidate from receiving a majority of the electoral votes. It is also possible for the candidate who wins the electoral vote to not be the candidate who receives the most popular votes. In fact, that has happened in the 2000 presidential election. For example, Al Gore received the most popular votes by a very narrow margin, and George W. Bush ended up winning the most electoral votes, also by a very narrow margin. Now, most of the time, the candidate that wins in the Electoral College also wins the popular vote, but on rare occasions, this can occur. Critics of the Electoral College have offered suggestions to improve it, and some have suggested that we abandon it and elect the president and vice president directly. Although, even though some have suggested it, so far nobody really has pushed that hard, and so the present system has remained virtually unchanged. So this is what I was talking about, the 2000 presidential election. These were your candidates. Al Gore, who was the vice president at the time, and Texas Governor George W. Bush were running against each other. Election troubles. On election night, before the polls were closed on the West Coast, the media was projecting Al Gore as the winner. A short time later, they revised their call and projected Bush as the winner. The election came down to the state of Florida. Whichever candidate took Florida would win the election, and the election was close in Florida. Late in the evening, it was announced that George W. Bush had won the election, and as news crews waited for Gore's concession speech, it was announced that Gore was not conceding. There were numerous problems with the voting, and Gore was requesting recounts in select counties in Florida. Ballot problems. Here's an example of the punch card ballot that was used in Florida. The punch card ballots used in Florida could lead to several problems with regards to interpreting the will of the voter. For example, if you look at this punch card ballot, here you can see the Republican candidate, George W. Bush, and Vice President Dick Cheney listed on the ballot, and there's an arrow pointing to a hole. This is a hole that you would punch if you were voting for the Republican candidate. Then, over here on the other side, you see at the top the Reform Party candidate of Pat Buchanan, and with Izola Foster as the vice presidential nominee, and here's another hole. And this hole would be the hole that you would use for the Reform Party. Then you move to the Democratic with Al Gore and Joe Lieberman, and here's the hole you would punch for them. And then, so really, as you go down, these holes are alternating back and forth. It would be very easy for somebody to look at this, look over on this side and see the first hole for the Republican and second hole for the Democrat and punch right here and actually cast their vote for the Reform Party candidate. Some ballots also were not punched, or were not completely punched, leaving what they referred to as dangling chads. The chads were the little pieces of the ballot that didn't punch cleanly. And so it really became no clear standard to determine the intent of the voter. I mean, if a ballot was punched all the way through, clearly that counted as a vote. If the ballot was not punched at all, there was no evidence that the voter had tried to cast a vote, then it's a non-vote. But what happens in between? And this picture here is really kind of one of my favorite pictures of the recounts. After the election on November 7th, the hand recounts started in select Florida counties. And as you can see, this is kind of what it looked like. They were looking at these ballots and holding them up to the light and trying to see if there was any possible indication that a voter had intended to cast a vote. And like I said, it becomes very difficult because there isn't really a clear standard of what counts as a vote and what doesn't. And so quite literally, you had disagreements in some of these places where the recounts were going on because different people with different party alliances were there looking at these recounts and disagreeing over what constituted a vote and what did not. And the original deadline for the recounts was November 14th, but it was extended by the Florida Supreme Court until November 26th. Well, that date came and went. And this leads us then into December and Bush versus Gore. The battle over recounts persisted until on December 12th, the Supreme Court ruled that the recounts must stop. And the ruling was that basically that if they weren't able to complete full recounts by that date, then the original results had to stand. And so, since the recounts weren't complete, the original results stood. Bush was declared the winner, taking Florida. The inauguration. The president is sworn into office during an inauguration ceremony. The ceremony is attended by leaders from all three branches of government, and it is held in January following the election year. It's always held on January 20th.